Well, the Supreme Court has started its 3 days of hearings into whether it's lawful or not lawful for the government to deport illegal migrants to Rwanda. The Court of Appeal had previously ruled that the policy was unlawful because Rwanda was deemed an unsafe country for asylum seekers. But now 5 senior judges will determine whether the Court of Appeal was right in its ruling. The government has warned it will opt out of the European Convention on Human Rights if it continues to be blocked by the courts from getting Rwanda flights off the ground. Joining me right now is the Director of the Centre for Migration and Economic Prosperity, Stephen Wolfe. Good afternoon to you, Stephen.
Good afternoon, Julia.
Thank you. Well, another day, another court hearing. Once again, more and more judges having a say whether or not we can carry out a policy voted for by a democratically elected government and parliament. I think a lot of us have sort of had our wits' ends on this, aren't we?
Aren't we indeed? And it's Groundhog Day all over again. And one of the most important factors about this decision today is whether the UK judicial system is more supreme than that of the unelected European Court of Human Rights. And of course, there is also a political decision for them, because if the government actually loses this case, it pushes into the forefront of politics that big argument within the Conservative Party, whether they actually will do something about the ECHR. Will they go, as Suella Braverman has said, to leave the European Court of Human Rights, and as echoed by Rishi Sunak, or will be another battle within the Tory party to say, let's find a fudge, let's a way we can stay in. And I think this time the public are watching with keen eyes who will win. Well,
indeed. I think we're all waiting for that. I was wondering, though, with the government, that actually it's a win-win for them. They either win the right from the courts for them to be able to stage those flights to Rwanda with migrants who have arrived here on those channel boats, or and everyone say brilliant, they finally having the policy. It may or may not have a deterrent effect, or they lose, in which case a lot of people who want those planes to take off, and very popular policy according to the polls, even among mainly Labour voters, they will be able to say once again it's the lefty lawyers and the courts, and we're not able to act. Don't blame us. I mean, there's no downside for the government on this.
No, and I agree. There really isn't any downside, which is why they should be pushing effectively a political open door for themselves. The public are really behind the Rwanda policy, which is why it's such a huge mistake for Keir Starmer to suggest that he would overrule it should the Rwanda policy go through, even if it's successful, because people are crying out for a really strong decision of unilateral government decisions to try and control the illegal migration routes into the United Kingdom. And of course, this is going to play very well for those Conservative MPs in the north of England and the Midlands, in those vital seats that are needed to be retained for the Conservative Party to remain in government. So Rishi Sunak should be working really hard post this decision to actually show that he's a strong leader, is changed, is able to take on the ECHR if he loses. The other positive.
Yeah, indeed. And in terms of this case, it was they won, they lost, they're hoping to win again in the Supreme Court. And again, I think, like most Brits, think that the supreme ruling in a court matter in this country should be made in a court in this country and not by judges in Strasbourg. But let's look at who those judges are, the 5 decision makers. There's Lord Reid. He's the president of the Supreme Court. He voted to block Shamima Begum's return to the UK. He also ruled that Boris Johnson's suspension of Parliament in 2019 was unlawful. Got Lord Sales. He ruled in 2016 that a Brexit deal could not proceed without a parliamentary vote. Used to work in Tony Blair's government. Lord Lloyd Jones, he used to make money working on EU law cases before becoming a judge. He also ruled that the 2019 suspension of Parliament was unlawful. Lord Briggs, he ruled against the then Home Secretary, Priti Patel, in 2020, finding a Pakistani man was a trafficking victim and should not be removed from the UK. And Lord Hodge, the Deputy President of the Supreme Court, he was one of 5 judges who quashed convictions for 4 protesters who formed a blockade outside a London arms fair. Now, that doesn't necessarily tell us what they're going to do with this case. But one of the concerns we have had over the years is that actually it's not just lefty lawyers, but judges as well, who are basically very much opposed to a lot of they think of them as populist policies. I would just say popular policies that this Tory government has tried to enact on this issue. Do you think that these judges will be coming at this looking purely at the law, or given that so much now is about interpretation of the law, that actually the government doesn't stand a chance.
Well, you wouldn't be surprised as a barrister who has to fall within the rules of the Bar Council to be as cautious as Priti Patel and Suella Braverman in my response to that, knowing full well how many people have already complained to the Bar Council about Suella Braverman's statements. But I do genuinely believe that judges, when they are enacted, despite their political views, will look at the law and will listen to the case on both sides of the argument. But I think what's really difficult for them in the way that the Supreme Court was set up, it does give much more open judgment and open views that the public can then cry out that you've gone against the popular will, you've gone against the political will because of that openness that in the decision making that they're doing. So they also have a rock and a hard place to themselves. They have to try and be completely neutral despite their own political feelings. But if they choose one side over another, they're going to get attacked as well. The key point I would always say is that let's look at the legal arguments that are used and their decisions afterwards.
Absolutely.
And if the decision goes against the government, then the government has a political manifesto to try and take on the European Courts of Human Rights, which those judges will be relying upon heavily.
Absolutely. And a lot of talk about leaving the European Convention on Human Rights, ignoring a European Court order. Bearing in mind, these are separate from the EU. This is a Strasbourg court. And we know that in many other countries, these pyjama orders, pyjama rulings, which are made late at night. As this is what happened. We had that plane on the tarmac at the airport, and one by one, these migrants were taken off the plane by their lawyers on the basis that there'd been this appeal to Strasbourg. And the ruling was, well, you know, doesn't look like it's legal, so we'll just stop it for now. And that's where we've been ever since. Most other European countries just completely ignore those rulings and nothing happens. Why don't we just ignore it?
Well, that's because we are such a great believer in the rule of law and actually abiding by not only the principles, but actually the letter of the law. So often we've seen these cases with European laws that have been undertaken in the Parliament and pushed out through the Commission and enacted in our own nation. We've done so much more severely than other countries. And that's a good thing in some ways, because the very nature of our country, the very nature of our common law, it gives a certainty to people that when the law is passed, this is what we should or shouldn't do. The fact that the kind of communitarian law that's in Europe gives that flexibility shouldn't mean that they're right. But what it does mean in this country is that we shouldn't always take the rules and legislation from those who are used to that different system by its very word alone. And we should be, that's one main reason why we should have taken control of our laws, be outside the European Union, and control it that way. That's the best decision.
Can I ask you about one other case that's been in the papers over the weekend? This is a convicted rapist, Joaquim Carlos. He's 43 years old. He came to this country on a visitor visa in 2007, and then he just stayed. He was supposed to leave a year later. He stayed. No one to get him. I mean, this is very, very normal. It's thought to be there are more than 1 million people in this country living here in that circumstance. In 2011, he'd been dealing drugs, living in Edinburgh illegally. He raped a woman. He was convicted of her rape at knife point. He served a jail sentence. And, of course, as someone who's convicted of a serious crime, served his sentence, he's due for deportation. However, the judge, having described a violent and persistent attack that had a devastating impact on his victim, he was ordered to be sent back to his native Gambia. However, he launched, everyone all together, be surprised, he launched a human rights challenge. And the tribunal ruled that because he had been treated for schizophrenia and he needed medication for that, the rapist would experience genuine difficulties being able to access a regular supply of his necessary medications and face a real risk of social isolation and stigmatisation, and therefore he cannot be deported. What do you make of that story?
Well, I think any right-minded person would see that as quite a disgraceful and utterly inhumane ruling to actually suggest that someone who has committed a rape and been convicted should not be deported for the use of the European Court of Human Rights. And this is the extension that people talk about when they say we want to be outside of the ECHR. It's very clear that politically, people's common sense would suggest that this man is a danger.
Yes.
But the ECHR rulings have allowed this extension on medical grounds. It's not there within the UN Refugee Convention. It's come through post.
I mean, we could just send him back. Here's 4 years' supply of schizophrenia drugs. Off you go.
Absolutely. And why can't we just put that out there? And that's a solution that perhaps the Home Office should look at. But when Suelo Braverman made this statement, when this made this statement to about the UN in America, she made this clear that this is a perfect type of example of where you get overreach and extension on international law to allow nefarious characters like this to breach it and stay. I always believe that we should rely on our own common law, our own legal system, our own common sense, and our own politics to remove people like this. And if the decision goes against the government on the ECHR and Rwanda on Wednesday, they should look to remove themselves, protect our citizens, and this is an example of how they can do it.